A choice right now, between fear and love. It's just a ride.
Out of the dark night of ignorance and into the shining light of truth.
Expanding reality.
A population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
There's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy.
We empower our experience by insisting on our authenticity.
That's very profound. Very.
Expanding reality.
Welcome to Expanding Reality. I am your host, Brandon Thomas. On this episode, we have the psychic doctor, Dr. Ian Rubenstein, and he is going to tell us all about his story on this one. Full disclosure here, guys, this is going to be a two-parter. They will be released as close together as I can possibly manage, but I've already set up a second episode with him that we haven't done yet, so that's why you're getting this first one, which is his story. Guys, his story is fascinating. The synchronicities, the way that this man has just all of it pretty much laid out for the direction that he goes on, and we talk about this and his recognition of this a little bit later on in his story. So you guys sit back, enjoy this. This guy is fascinating. Look forward to more. We had a lot that we couldn't cover in this one, thus the part two. So without any further ado, guys, Dr. Ian Rubenstein. Ladies and gentlemen, extremely excited to present to you Dr. Ian Rubenstein. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us. How's your day going over there?
Good. It's nice to be back speaking to you, Brandon.
Yes,
so we're gonna have a good chat today, aren't we?
I am really looking forward to it. You are a fascinating guy. You've got just an incredible story, and I cannot wait to get into it. So my audience is just going to love you. So let's start with a little bit of background on yourself for the audience that might not know you just yet.
Okay. So I'm a 66-year-old primary care physician. I work in London, England, so I'm a general practitioner, as we call it. I work in the National Health Service, which is our socialised healthcare system, which means that I look after, together with a bunch of 10 of us, 10 doctors and 3 nurses, we look after about 14,000 patients situated in northeast London. It's a mixed area, not a very well-off area. We've got areas of quite high deprivation, about 130, 40, 50 different languages spoken in our part of the world. And it's been there since 1984, so it's interesting. It's busy, very busy.
I would think so, yeah, and especially with everything going on right now, no matter how you feel about it, something's going on, right?
Yeah.
So what got you into the medical field in the first place?
Okay, so, it wasn't really, I guess it was partly because my father had rheumatoid arthritis. He was a London cab driver, and he had to, he couldn't work because of it. And I think that I always thought I was looking for the cure. But to be honest, I don't recall ever having any amazing feelings for becoming a doctor. But I guess the people around me could see that I was heading that way. I come from a large Jewish family, and every Jewish mother wants her son to be a doctor, though my mum says she didn't want me to. But certainly when I was at school, I was encouraged to go into medicine by my teachers. The reason why I chose medicine was because I was not really good at maths, and I was doing sciences, because in those days, if you were a boy, it was even though I was good at history and English, really, but the sheer power of science in the 1960s was so enthralling. It was like modern wizardry, and I was captivated by the moon landings, all this stuff. So I really wanted to go into science, even though I struggled with the maths. But I had the good fortune to be reached by a good maths teacher, a guy called Mr. Brewer, who got me through my maths exams. But it was never my strong point. So I ended up heading towards a degree, a biological sciences degree. And I wanted a job at the end of it because of the insecurities I had with my father losing his job. And a good secure job is becoming a doctor. It's biological sciences. That's my rationalization for going that way. But when I was at school, I was interested in all sorts of things, and one of the things that got my interest was consciousness, because I grew up in the 60s when people were taking acid and stuff like that. And I was never into that. And I always felt that as human beings, we had much more power than we thought we had. And I remember one of my friends, Alan Stockbridge, who was at school, he was taking acid, and I said, look, man, you don't need to do this. Let me hypnotize you. You can have a good trip, just using hypnosis. And I hypnotized him. He did. And after that, he told all his friends. And then I ended up having a load of school kids at school wanting me to hypnotize them. And it was quite funny, really, because I went to quite a rough school. And to stop myself being beaten up in the schoolyard at recess, I ended up working in the school library, which had the bonus that you could do your homework. See, when you got home at the end of the day, you could just read or watch TV and not have to do your homework there. And I mean, I wore glasses. I was a bit overweight. I was geeky. And I was the most unlikely person to become suddenly this guru, because all of a sudden the kids started coming up to me and wanting me to hypnotize them. And it reached a point where there were long lines of kids waiting in line for me to hypnotize them. And you couldn't get down the school corridor. I mean, it was astonishing.
What were some of the things that you would hypnotize these kids to see or do or anything like that? Like,
well,
why would
you
they
name it.
Coming back?
You name it. I mean, the very first person I hypnotized was a girl called Kathy, and I got her to imagine she had a steel rod in her arm. Then we got the school football captain to try and bend her arm, and he couldn't. So that was impressive. Imagining they were chickens.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, you can imagine a child with that power and what.
Yeah, absolutely. Or making someone invisible. Like so they couldn't see something. They try and sit in a chair, and someone would be. I mean, stuff like that.
That is one of the things I am fascinated with about hypnosis. I've heard of this doctor who called a daughter and son, or a daughter and father, on stage, and he had like a watch, and the hypnotist hypnotized the father to think that the daughter was invisible. And then he held the watch up to her back, and the guy read the time or read an inscription on the back of it as if she wasn't even there. That is fascinating to me. How you just delete somebody.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had that, but I did once, just as an aside, I hypnotized a woman. I was fitting in an intrauterine device for contraceptive purposes, and I used to use hypnosis a lot just to relax her. And when I finished, she said, well, that was interesting. Would you mind regressing me to form, see if I could see a form of life? So while she was there with my nurse, I said, okay, let's do it. So I put her back into a trance. It scared the bejesus out of me, because suddenly her left arm and her left leg curled up, and she looked really old. And I thought she'd had a stroke. When I tested her reflexes, she became hyperreflexic with an upgoing plantar response, which is exactly what you get with the stroke.
Wow.
And there's no, I mean, you couldn't fake that. You didn't know what I just said, but then any doctor would know that means there's a stroke on that side. She certainly didn't know that. And that was genuine response. And I actually thought she had a stroke. So I quickly brought her back, and she was completely normal. And that really freaked me out, because as far as I was concerned, she looked like she'd adopted the position and the body mannerisms and the reflexes of an elderly person who'd had a stroke. And after that, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that again. So that was interesting. But that was after eventually, obviously, I went to medical school and became a doctor. But what happened at the school, going back to school, was I had all these kids being hypnotized. And of course, the school authorities got a bit worried about it. And the deputy principal called me into her office. And she was very nice. She said, look, Ian, I do believe in hypnosis. I've got a degree in psychology, and I think it's real. But you can't do it at school. And by the way, sign this disclaimer. I mean, she was covering her ass with paperwork, and that was in the mid-'60s. That was very forward-thinking. I mean, everyone's doing that now.
Yeah, she was PC before PC was a thing.
Yeah, she was ahead of the game there.
Yeah.
But she said, look, when you go to medical school, so she'd obviously had in mind that I was going to go to medical school. She said, when you go to medical school, they'll teach you this. But because they don't. They don't teach you this at all.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was studying to be a GP. So in the UK, you have to go on what's called a training school. So you're a qualified doctor. You've done your internship, and then you're doing your residence posts. And you do I did a 4-year scheme where you go through various different specialties, OBGYN, pediatrics, psychiatry, geriatrics, internal medicine, and then you spent a year in general practice as a qualified doctor, but learning as an apprentice, sort of learning the rules. And when I was doing OBGYN, we had a woman who had a hysterectomy, and she'd had a catheter in, and we couldn't get the catheter out. Every time we took the catheter out, she couldn't. She went into what we call urinary retention. She couldn't empty her bladder, and she was in hospital for a week. And the specialist I was working with, she was getting very frustrated. And I said to her, look, perhaps I could try and hypnotize her. And she said, well, give it a go. And I did, and it was fine. And the specialist was so impressed that she started sending me private patients. So after I did my OBGYN, I then moved into general practice for a year. And I was a general practice trainee, and I was the only general practice trainee who had a private hypnosis practice, which was actually strictly against the rules. In fact, the guy who trained me in general practice, he's become a good friend of mine. And I told him just a couple of weeks ago what I was doing, and he said, "You never told me that." He said, "I'd have slated you if I'd have known that in those days." I said, "Yeah, that's why I never told you." So, but it was, and I used hypnosis when I moved into my practice. I joined my current practice in 1984, and I had a thriving hypnosis practice then, and it's very powerful, and I'd recommend it. The only problem is the way it works in the UK, you literally have 10 minutes per patient in a clinic. So a morning clinic would be like 18 patients seen at 10-minute intervals, and you just don't have the time for it. So at the same time I was learning, I was training to be a GP. One of the guys in the practice when I was training, he'd got into acupuncture, and he taught me some acupuncture. So I incorporated that into my practice as well. And I've kept that going because with acupuncture, it's pretty time efficient. You can see 2, 3, 4 patients, put needles in, put them in a room, see somebody else, leave the needles in for half an hour, and I get good results with that as well. But it's not traditional Chinese acupuncture. That's what I call barefoot acupuncture. It's a few conditions like migraine, back pain, arthritis. There's certain standard points you use, and there's plenty of that in medical practice to keep you going for ages. By the way, I mean, this is something I offer in addition to my patients. We don't actually get paid for this. So the way it works in the UK is you're given a salary. So a part of what you do is based on how many vaccinations you give or how many smears you do. But on the whole, you're given a salary. So you're pretty much given free rein. You don't have to worry about the money. We don't charge our patients. There's no money exchanges hands. Patients don't have to sign up with an insurance company. So they come and see the doctor, and we do what we think is needed. And if you want to do a bit of extra, that's up to me. Doesn't cost the patient anything. So there's literally no money changing hands here. And the way it works in the UK, because I know a lot of you in the US don't really understand how it works. So when you want to see a doctor, you will go and see your registered doctor. So everybody's registered with a practice. You don't see a specialist direct. And most of the case, the general practitioner, which is what I am, which is known as a primary care physician, would deal with pretty much everything. But if there's stuff that requires specialist input, then you will refer them to what we call a consultant, or as a specialist. That's a person who's trained, who's a specialist in the field. But a lot of the stuff we handle on our own here. I worked at the London School of Economics for a year in 1983. About a third of my patients were Americans, and they used to come in and say, "Hi, doc, I want to see a dermatologist," and I get really upset because in the UK you just don't do that because that's insulting to the doctor. You think, I can't handle it. I had to realise that actually in the US, you're so used to managing your own healthcare, you know what you want.
Yeah.
And so you'll see the gynecologist, and I understand that obviously now, but it took me a while to come. There's a totally different culture. But the nice thing is being a doctor in the UK is money doesn't come into it. We get paid our salary and we just do what we have to. Pretty much most of the medicines are the patients either get it free or pay a very small charge, a few dollars in American terms for their medication. And for instance, if you're diabetic, you don't pay anything, so you don't have to worry about paying for insulin and stuff like that.
I think that should be the way that it is. I mean, especially, and we do the argument about what's going on right now with the thing they're calling a vaccine, which I disagree with, that it is a vaccine, but the thing that they're calling that, it's completely free, and they're incentivizing people to do it with donuts and scratch-off lottery tickets and beer, and they're incentivizing all these crap that is not good for your health to get something that they're claiming is good for your health, that I also disagree with. But I will say what's interesting is to the point to that is that chemo costs an arm and a leg just to survive. Same thing with insulin, with diabetes over here. But this thing that they're calling a vaccine is not. And so it's interesting how they frame it under the guise of public health and that they're out for your best good, but it just doesn't, like, the actions don't match up, right?
Well, it's a very different health culture. And in the UK, it's all NHS, and people just expect the NHS to perform and do it. It's a great shame, really. I mean, I don't want to criticize another country, but bearing in mind that you're the wealthiest country in the world, you'd have thought a little bit of your GDP into sort of universal healthcare would help. But I know there's a very different culture between the UK and the US, and I appreciate there's a much more culture of individuality, and it's very important for America. So I can't, it's very difficult growing up in the UK to understand that. So, but I mean, it's just the way things are over here. So basically, I'm responsible for the health of my patients, and I try and do my damnedest to help. Although, like every system, you're often fighting the system. I mean, there's bureaucracy. It was just like in the American insurance system. You've still got the bureaucrats who get in the way and all this stuff. It's the same, the same old things. So that's how it works over here. And like I said, I've been in my practice since 1984, and so it's serious stuff. So you can imagine how lucky I am to be in a practice where, when I started going psychic, so to speak, and being to think I was possibly in contact with people, speaking to the dead, that my partners, were very, very understanding. Because the culture in our practice is that basically we try and encourage each one of us to expand our skills in whatever way we feel we can offer our patients. But I have to say, it's unusual, really unusual.
Well, it's unusual currently. Maybe it's not. In the future, maybe this is the direction that we're going, is the marrying of the Eastern and Western medicines. And I do want to get into that here in a little bit. So set us up on how you figured out, through your medical training and going down that road, how you figured out that you had some gifts that other folks aren't really possessing in your mind.
Well, I didn't until I didn't. I mean, I didn't figure it out. It came. I mean, I must be thick or something stupid, because it took a great deal. So let's fast forward to 2003. It happened to me in 2003, and I guess you say that's when I had my Kundalini experience. But it was preceded by a classic sort of situation of deconstruction. So I need to tell you about my family. So my father was an only child, so his family doesn't really come into it, but my mother was one of five. She came from a large Jewish East End family. So her father came from Poland at the turn of the 20th century, and he was a baker, and he had a couple of shops in the East End. He had five children, three girls, one of whom was my mother, and two brothers, and two boys. And he would have done very well. He had a couple of shops, but he was very fond of horse racing. At the end of the week, he'd put his hand in the till and blow all the takings on the horses. And I think this is what was the root of the problems in my family, because I realized when I was the age of 47 that I was having problems relating to my parents. I mean, it took me a while to make the break. I was a good Jewish boy, I went to medical school. I tried to look after my mum and dad, but I wasn't quite doing everything that my mum wanted me to do. And bearing in mind I had family commitments, I then had a wife and two kids. This starts to cause tension. I mean, basically, she wanted all my attention. I couldn't do it. And it became a very toxic situation. In fact, looking back, my family was really quite inward looking. And I realized that my cousins had all had similar problems with their parents. And things blew up in 2001, where I had a flaming row with my sister and my mum and dad. and I was basically expelled from the family. And I really didn't see them for a few years, maybe 3 years. Had to break away from them. And I was really very miserable about this. I was 47, really busy practice, doing on-call, working all the hours, 2 young children. My wife was a doctor as well. She's also working. So we were a busy family. And I was literally on my knees, and I was in a terrible state. I mean, to the point where my wife was reading books out loud, passages from books on toxic families to me, so I could understand what I was going through. And so there I was at the end of a busy morning clinic in my health centre, and the last patient of that morning was a guy called Keith Bishop. Now, I'd known Keith for about 19 years by then. He is a public relations guy, and he used to work at BBC Television Centre. He was he assisted the Director General of the BBC. So that's quite a senior position. But he came from a working class family like me. In fact, he was born. His family lived in the area where my practice was, and he'd always felt like a fish out of water. That he was sort of in the wrong place, pretty much like I did, because I always felt that in the medical field that I shouldn't really be there because I didn't come from that sort of background. No one in my family had even gone to university at that stage, or no, that's not true. I mean, my cousins had gone to university, but my antecedents hadn't gone to university, and none of them had been doctors. I mean, they were basically from Russia, Eastern European Jewish immigrants fleeing the ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe in those days. So we were kindred spirits in that way. And whilst he was setting himself up in his PR company and going through all that, I used to spend some time of an evening. If I was on call, I'd see him in my office, and we'd go. He'd talk about his life. Well, counselling sort of thing, really. He didn't know a lot about me, but I knew a lot about him. So we had quite a good relationship. So this was the 4th of July, 2003, my personal Independence Day, when it all kicked off. So Keith was the last patient of my morning clinic, and he tends to be a bit late. He's a bit unreliable, is Keith, really. He's a lovely, lovely man, and I owe him a lot. But he works in a field where it's all a bit lovey-dovey, and they say one thing and maybe it doesn't happen. I mean, he works in the showbiz field, but he's very entertaining, and he always tells me some interesting stories about showbiz when he comes. So he hadn't turned up, and I thought, well, he's not going to turn up. I'll go out. I had some house calls to do. I'd like to go to the gym and go for a swim, in the afternoon. I tried to get up out of my chair, but I felt something push me back down. Tried again, something pushed me back down. And as I sat down the second time, my phone rang, and it was my receptionist, Carol. And she said, Mr. Bishop's PA's been on the phone. He's at the local station. He's sorry he's late. He'll be there in 5 minutes. Can you hang on? So yeah, I'll hang on, but I'm not going to hang around all day. So he came into my room. He was red-faced. He was panting. Yeah, he was out of breath. He'd run from the station. And of course, I had to take his blood pressure. So I had to give him time to calm down. So he sat down in my chair, and I thought he was just going to tell me a few stories. He started off telling me some stories. He looks after a few famous people, and I thought he started to tell me some stories. Then he looked at me quizzically and said, "Hey, Doc, I've got this man here. He says he's your grandfather, the one you never met, and he wants to tell you something." And I thought, the first thing I thought was, that's interesting, because I've been thinking about my grandfather, because he was the grandfather I'd ever met, my mother's father. And I traced him to the root of the problems I had in my family, because I think his gambling behavior caused all the insecurities that blew up in my face. And my second thought was, Keith's gone mad, and I'm going to have to sort of get the boys in white coats round to get him admitted to a psychiatric hospital. But I mean, I said to him, well, are you telling me you hear spirits? He said, yeah, I always have done. I said, how come you never told me before? I've known you for years. He said, well, it's not the sort of thing you normally tell your doctor, is it? He'd think you're mad. I'm thinking, well, that's true. I think you're mad. But he said, now listen, he said, give me the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to listen to what your grandfather's going to tell me, and then I'll tell you what he says. If he says anything that you don't like, it's him, it's not me. I thought, okay, I listened. And then the next 20 minutes or so, he started to speak rapidly as if he was listening to someone over his shoulder. He wasn't in a trance or anything, but he was like he was listening, and very rapidly told me everything that was happening in my life, which was uncanny because there was no way he could know that. And then at the end of it, he seemed to sort of snap into around. He sort of looked less dazed and said, "Was that okay?" And I said, "That was amazing." He said, then he said to me, he said, "William tells me that you should be doing this." I said, "Who's William?" He said, "Oh, he used to be my boss at the BBC. When he died, he became my spirit guide." And I'm thinking, this is cuckoo, he's got a screw loose. He said, "You should be doing this." I said, "Doing what?" He said, "Listening to spirit." I thought, "Listening to spirit? What does he mean? Spirit? Spirits? I don't know what this term spirit means." He said, "You're like a man on the edge of a cliff. Don't be afraid to take a leap of faith off the cliff. They'll catch you." And with that, he left my room. He also said that I had a brother in spirit, which I denied. He said, "Yes, you do. Your mum had a miscarriage before you were born, and your brother grew up in spirit." And I remember my mum did have a miscarriage before I was born. But of course, I also know that about 50% of women have miscarriages that we now know. So it's not, that's a lucky guess. He said, "Well, look, he'll come to you tonight around about 11 o'clock. So I want you to sort of meditate at that time and see what happens." So at 11 o'clock that night, I kissed my wife goodnight. She went to bed. I went upstairs in the upstairs bedroom, a converted attic, and lay there, waited for my departed fetal brother to come, and absolutely nothing happened. And I thought, well, this is just bonkers, and that was it. Totally dismissed it. But then the shit hit the fan. The more stuff happened. Do you want me to tell you what happened? Or?
Please. I definitely want to unpack some of this stuff, but please keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing that happened was I had this weird dream. Now, I mean, it's just a dream. Weird dreams. What are weird dreams? But I was at my, again, it's doing with my family. I was at my aunt's house, and she used to give she was very well off. She used to give lavish dinner parties. And I was sitting at a long white table, a table covered with a nice white tablecloth, sitting opposite my cousin Carol. And for some reason in my dream, she was trying to, she's a psychotherapist, and she was trying to refer me a patient. And I was to do a chest x-ray on this patient. I remember saying, "I can't do a chest x-ray, she's not my patient." Then I heard myself saying, "Anyway, I'm not psychic and I can't see auras." And with that, I heard a voice to my left, a Cockney voice. And at the head of the table was an Indian looking man, not a Native American, but a guy from India. But he was dressed wearing a flat cap like you see in the Cockney barrow boys wearing. And he had a Cockney accent, and above him was a light on the wall with like little crystal things, like a crystal chandelier on it. Not a chandelier, like a lampshade. And with that, he said, "Of course you can, boss." I said I couldn't see auras. He said, "Of course you can, boss." And with that, he turned around, flicked a switch on the wall, and these amazing gem-like shafts of blue light came out. And he said, "What do you do with all that blue?" And in my dream, I heard myself saying, as if I'd known all along, but I'd temporarily forgotten, "I give it to people." And I just woke up crying. Wow. To the point where I woke my wife up and told her this dream. I said, "Do you think I'm going mad?" And she said, "Well, you've always been a bit mad, but don't worry, I still love you." And she went back to sleep. But I knew that whatever was going to happen, she would be with me on my journey. But that was just a dream. But other stuff started happening. What else happened? Oh,
Did you start seeing auras after that dream?
No. I can't. I have had experience where I've seen auras, but no. I then ended up going to what happened the next time? Yeah, I then ended up going to a party, another family party a few days later, where the first person I spoke to told me she'd grown up in a haunted house. And I just thought, this stuff's too much. I don't want to hear this stuff. It's just, it was disturbing me. There'd been other stuff which I couldn't remember, but I'd been disturbed by these weird coincidences. So I remember saying to my wife, "Well, I'm not speaking to this woman. You take over. I'm going to go and get a drink." So I went into the kitchen to get a drink. And then there was another door leading to another garden. And as I walked out into this other garden, and a long distant cousin from mine called Rose, her name was Rose, was sitting on a swing bench. And as I walked out into the garden, I overheard her saying, "I used to be a spiritual healer, but when the kids were born, I had to give it up." And I stopped. And I said, "Rose, I keep on bumping into all this stuff. What's happening? I never came across all this talk before." And she said, "Oh, that's simple." And she said, "They want to work with you." I said, what do you mean they want to work with you? She said, well, she explained that when doctors and nurses die, they go to the other side, as she believed, and that they often want to help to carry on working on the earth plane, and therefore they'll pick someone and try and work with them if they're open to it. And I just said, well, I don't know, I'm not into all this stuff. She said, well, she said, if they want to work with you, they'll find a way. And I just found it a bit disturbing at the time. And then what else? I mean, other stuff happened. I walked into my room one day and threw my keys on my desk. I went to do a house call on a patient that was just around the corner. And as I left my room, I felt a blow to the back of my head and heard a voice. I literally heard a voice saying, pick up your car keys or they get stolen. And I didn't. I thought this is crazy. I walked to the patient's house, did the house call. When I came back, someone had taken the key from my desk and got into my car. Now, what had happened was that it was in the doctor's car park, and there was an apartment block opposite, and someone had seen a shifty-looking youth pressing the keys and trying to get into my car, seeing which indicator lights flashed, and she'd phoned the practice, and they'd chased this youth away, but he'd run off with my car keys, got into my car, probably taken my prescription pad, maybe some drugs, and my mobile phone. So I had to report this to the police, obviously. So I had to go. There's a police station across the road from my practice. And when I went in there, I had this weird incident with a policeman there. Well, he wasn't a policeman. He was a civilian, what they call it. There's the Metropolitan Police in London. They have police officers, but they also have civilian staff there. And he was dressed in the civilian staff uniform. And I had to report this crime. And he asked me my date of birth, and I told him what it was. He said, oh, you're a Leo like me. And I said, oh, are you into all this new age shit then? I said. He said, yeah, I'm a psychiatric nurse at the local hospital. I'm doing a degree in spirituality. I'm just doing this job to earn a bit of extra cash. So I said, well, you'll be interested. I heard a voice telling me my car key we're going to get stolen. So with that, he said, well, we were meant to meet. He slapped his hand on the desk and said, I'll give you a reading. And with that, he drew out a pack of cards from his desk. And they were Native American medicine cards, which I'd never seen before. I said, I said, what are those? He said, well, choose a card. Each card's got a meaning, and I'll give you a reading. And I thought, well, this is crazy. I'm in the Twilight Zone here. I'm in the police station trying to report a crime. I'm getting a reading. And I mean, the reading was, I picked a card. He looked at it, looked it up. And he said, the question in my head was, actually, at the time, I'd been writing a piece of software for 9 years. It was going to make my fortune. I was going to be the next Bill Gates. It didn't work. But
that's good. We don't need another Bill Gates.
No. It was to do on-call rosters for doctors. It was a good piece of software, but anyway. And the question I asked in my head was, would this be successful? And the answer he gave me was, the world was not yet ready. And I thought, okay, thank you very much. Just give me my crime reference number so I can tell my insurance company to change all the locks on my car. And as I walked out of this police station, I had the weird feeling that were I to turn round, he wasn't going to be there, And I went back to the surgery and told my receptionists, all the girls I worked with and my colleagues there, and they started whistling the Twilight theme, Twilight Zone theme, So I felt I'd crossed into this weird world of odd coincidences. Eventually it was my wife who helped me. So, and this is where I need to go back in time. So let's go back in time. So I had this really, really strange thing happen to me when I was 19 that I sort of put to one side. So I was at University of Nottingham, where I trained to be a doctor. And my best school friend, Nick, had gone to the University of Leicester. So Leicester and Nottingham are very close, about 30 miles separate. And I used to hang out with Nick a lot. I used to work really hard when I was at Nottingham. And then I used to go and party with Nick because Nick was doing physics and his degree was much less onerous than mine. He actually used to run a discotheque. So he had lots of friends and they had some pretty wild parties. I got to know all his friends. So it was the first summer 1974, the first long vacation. And we'd all ended up back in London, back in our houses. And I was at Nick's house with my sister, and his girlfriend Felicity was staying over for the summer vacation. Now, the background to that is that my sister had a big crush on Nick, and Nick's girlfriend Felicity had a big crush on me. So it was all very intense. And I just started going out with my girlfriend, who subsequently became my wife. So it was all very adolescent, all very, very intense. But to our credit, we never took drugs. We never smoked anything. We were clean. I mean, we weren't into that sort of thing in those days. So we were just drinking coffee and hanging out and just talking and laughing and joking. And I was sitting opposite Felicity, and Nick was sitting next to her. My sister was sitting so she saw our profiles. And I was obviously enjoying the attention I was getting from Felicity, no doubt about it. And she was quite an attractive looking girl, but darkly complected, dark hair, long dark hair down to her waist, brown eyes. She didn't have her bangs, her hair was parted in the center. And all of a sudden, as I was speaking, there was this blonde haired snow queen looking at me with bangs, shoulder length blonde hair, very high cheekbones, and piercing blue eyes that looked right into me. And the most interesting thing was that her lips didn't seem to be properly formed. They were distorted, very thick, as if they were covered with frosted white lipstick. And these piercing blue eyes looked right into my soul. And I got these messages sort of dumped into my head. Now you call it a download, but we didn't have that term in 1974. That's a modern term, isn't it? And there were 4 messages: stop, what you're doing is wrong. I knew what that meant. I was sort of playing on her emotions. And then mark this: know there's more to life than meets the eye, and one day you will understand. And that literally blew me away. I mean, if you've ever seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the flying saucer lands and the ramp comes in, this white light comes out, it was like that feeling of whoa, but no white light. But it was like, wow, I've been hit by something. And that precise instant, my sister, who was aged 15 at the time, started screaming at the top of her voice, "My God, can you see those lips?" Because she'd seen the profile and she'd seen these really distorted lips that Felicity's face was now sporting, I suppose you say. And I turned around to my sister and said, "What, you've seen it too?" And looked back, and Felicity was completely normal. Now, Nick and Felicity weren't aware of anything happening to them, but they just saw our reaction. So, I mean, by this time, tears were streaming down my face. I mean, I was upset, but not frightened. I was knocked back by the emotion. My sister was hysterically frightened to the point where she still doesn't like to talk about it. So we ran around like headless chickens, got into had my dad's car, and we piled into my dad's car, went round to my parents and sort of woke them up at 2 a.m., but they weren't best pleased. Next day, I phoned all my friends around, and my friend Steve said, "Well, I don't know what this is, but my next door neighbour is a medium. Why don't you come and tell him what it was?" So went to Steve's house the next day and explained what happened. And this tall, gangling man, he was about 27. We were all 19, prematurely balding, strange man called Keith Hudson. And he showed me his book, which was a Phenomena of Spiritualism, I think it was called. He said, "What you saw was a spirit guide protecting her from my emotional," I was probably feeding off her energies, enjoying the attention. And I thought, well, I don't buy spirit guides, Keith. It's not very scientific, is it? It must have been a hallucination. But that means telepathy is real, which puts me in a bind, because there's nothing in my science books that says telepathy is real either. But telepathy felt better than spirit guides for some reason. It sounded more scientific, thought
it's
transfer.
Almost like it almost refers to a science we haven't figured out yet, rather than something woo-woo that cannot be explained by conventional means. It's a closer step.
Yeah, exactly. And I carry that with me all my life, because what do you do with that? So you park it somewhere. You can't factor it into your life. You just hive it away. And occasionally I tell people at parties, and occasionally I tell my patients. So I remember once I had a guy who was dying, and he said, "Doc, what do you think there's anything afterwards?" And I didn't know. I said, "Look, I don't know, but this is the experience I had. And I know a guy who said that was a spirit guide, which would imply there is life after death." And when he died, his wife came to see me and said, that story you told, his name was Len, that story you told, Len, he found very helpful, because he said that if an intelligent, educated man like my doctor had that experience, then that gave him some hope. So that was useful. But I mean, that's as far as it went. I mean, I had no other interest in it. I suppose that's as far as it went. Another story which I ought to tell you about, which might put more light on it, is I actually have had a near-death experience. And that was when I was the age of 9. And that's probably, now knowing that with hindsight, I now think that's probably quite important. So when I was a kid, the doctors took your tonsils out at the drop of a hat. They don't like to do that now. But, and I scuppered myself really because, like I said, there was some abnormal illness behavior in my family. And I pretty quickly figured out that if I had a sore throat, I got off school, my mum tucked me up in bed. She made me tomato soup and a buttered roll, which seemed a lot better than going to school. So I used to pretend I had sore throats. And eventually it reached a point where I had so many sore throats. She took me to see the doctor, and the doctor said, "You've got to have your tonsils out, mate." So that was it. So there we are. I ended up having my tonsils removed. And that was a pretty minor operation. But I was age 9. I was in hospital. I had my tonsils removed, but I started bleeding from the operation. When they take tonsils out, they literally cut them out, and they cauterize it's called the tonsillar bed. But it didn't take with me, and I was swallowing a lot of blood and vomiting up blood. And I remember being really ill and vomiting up a lot of blood. And I lost a lot of blood. I wasn't ill enough to the point where I needed a blood transfusion. So I couldn't have been that ill, but I was quite ill. And I had to have another operation where they cauterized it a bit more. Again, not a big operation. But anyway, it took a while to get hold of mum and dad to come and sign the consent form for the operation. So it took a while. So I remember being anesthetized, and then I remember finding myself in a tunnel. But I was at one end of the tunnel. And in this dream I had, which I always thought was a dream under the anesthetic, I felt that there was this big stalk, like a big umbilical cord, but much thicker, being unwound from the center of my abdomen, like taffy or molten glass. And it was sort of gently twisting round and going down this dark tunnel. I don't know, gardeners have these black polytunnels, we call them in the UK. They're like hoops with wire hoops in, which you can grow plants in. It's like being in one of those, a big one, but black. And at the end of this stalk, which is being extruded from me, was a little light. And I knew that although my body was here, I actually was that little light, a little spark.
Yeah.
I remember it was going round the tunnel curved to the left, then I lost consciousness. Now, I'd always had that. And in fact, I used to tell that story a lot about the day I almost died. And I stopped telling it when I had more stories to tell. And I actually forgot about it. I didn't even put it in my book because I didn't know the significance of it. But of course, we now know that people who have near-death experience, and you don't have to be at near-death to have a near-death experience, but there was the tunnel, there was the light. Okay, I mean, I was the little light on the end of this stalk, but it was definitely what you had some of the elements of a near-death experience, and I was in physical distress as a result. I don't think I was going to die, but nonetheless, I think you would call that a near-death type experience. And we now know that people who have these often do come back and often then go on to have psychic experiences or other transformative experiences. So maybe it was that. And an interesting echo from that is that took place in the hospital where I subsequently did my specialty training, So I mentioned where I did my OBGYN and all that stuff. So when I was doing OBGYN, when you were doing emergencies, you'd have to sometimes do what's called a DNC, where you scrape the womb of a woman who's maybe she's got some bleeding thing just to stop her bleeding. That'd be done under a general anesthetic. It's quite a simple thing to do. Even me as a junior resident could do that when I was on call. I wouldn't have to get my boss in. So one evening, a woman came in. She'd had a baby. She was still bleeding. She needed a DNC. I phoned the operating theatre, booked the theatre, booked the anaesthetist. And as I phoned the theatre staff said, well, the theatre, the normal theatres being decorated, there's a different theatre. I'll show you the way. Someone came to get me to show me the way. And as I walked into this operating theatre, I said, I've been here before. I just knew. And it was like I'd been hit over the head with something. It was that the house. And I said, I've been here before. And the woman who took me in there, she said, you can't have been. This has been mothballed for 10 years. It's the old paediatric ENT theatre. And that would have been the theatre where I had my near-death experience. Now, that's interesting in itself because all operating theatres look the same. I was 9 when it happened. And also, you get anaesthetised in an anteroom, not the operating theatre. So how did I know it was that one? So that's, again, something indicative that there's something odd going on here in my life. And it's only with hindsight. It's only when you see the pattern over many years, begin to piece it together. I think that's probably where it all came from. So that I've told you the story now of how I met Keith Hudson, who's the guy who told me about Felicity's face. So fast forward to 2003, when I'm going through all this time looking around. Remember, my wife's heard the story of Felicity's face ad nauseum. I mean, she's sick of it. And she said, you've told it to everybody. There can't be anybody, but you haven't told it to. Of course, after this, I'm now telling it to the entire world. She's given up now. She just said, you're obviously meant to tell this story.
This is a global audience, man. You just told
yeah, exactly. She said, I never thought. She obviously meant to tell this story. But my wife, thank God, I mean, she's Indian. And she's a lot more open to these things than I was from my background. She's not particularly religious, but she's Hindu. And in her religion, they're very open to these spiritual experiences. So she's been really, really, really supportive of me. She was looking in the local paper and she saw a small advertisement in the local paper for the local spiritualist church, the Beacon of Light Spiritualist Church in the borough where I live. And she said, and it mentioned that a guy called Keith Hudson was giving a demonstration of clairvoyance. And she said, is that Keith Hudson, the guy with Felicity's face? I said, yeah. She said, well, we've got to go and see him and, see if he'll give you a message. I said, I'm not going. She said, well, we must go. And the reason why she said we've got to go is because the day before that, I've been telling one of my patients about all these weird coincidences that have been happening to me. And one of my patients is a guy called Dave Godfrey. Dave's wife, Rhoda, worked with my wife. So my wife's a doctor, and Rhoda was a health visitor. And Dave had a science degree, but he was actually a spiritual healer. He'd given up being a science teacher, but a spiritual healer. Very sensible guy. And I told Dave what's happened to me. He said, Ian, you need to join a circle. I said, well, what are they? He said, well, they're based at spiritualist churches, and it's where they train mediums. I said, well, look, I'm a non-religious Jew. My wife's Hindu. People like us don't go to churches. And he said, this spirit wants to work with you. They'll find a way. And the next day, my wife Poonam noticed this small ad, and she remembered what Dave, who she knew because she worked with Rhoda, his wife, and said, that's why we've got to go. So this thing, she said, maybe the spirit world wants to give you a message. So that's why we ended up there. But the very first time I'd met Keith Hudson when I was 18, he looked at me and said, Ian, you've got a lot of knowledge around. You don't know you know it, but you will one day. And I thought, well, he would say that. I was going to medical school. That's an easy win. So I didn't take much credence. Fast forward 2003, I'm sitting at the back, trying to hide myself away at the back of this congregation. And Keith Hudson's there, and he looks the same. I mean, I've lost all my hair. I used to have a beard, I had dark hair. I looked completely different. Keith looked the same. He'd already lost most of his hair by the time he was 27. And it was obviously the same man. And he gave everybody a message, fair clip, about 30 people in the congregation. He gave everyone a brief message, and he came to me. I sort of tried to make myself look small. He said, sir, he obviously didn't know who I was. He said, you have a lot of knowledge around you. You don't know you know it, but they're telling me you will very soon, and you're going to be writing a book about it. And of course, I thought, well, he must say that to everyone, because that's what he told me when I was 18. Actually, that wasn't, he doesn't say it to everyone, because I subsequently started training with him. Now he's saying he's going to write a book about it. And he gave me basically the same message he gave me years ago. So at the end of the service, the president of the church said, Mr. Hudson hasn't got a car. Can anyone give me a lift back to Walthamstow where he lives? It's not far from where I live. So I put my hand up and said, yeah, but only if he comes back to my house and has a cup of tea first. As I raced up towards him, he took a step back because as he said, you get a lot of strange people at spiritualist congregations.
Imagine, yeah.
And I can come on a bit strong sometimes. So when I saw he looked a bit horrified, I said, Keith, it's Ian Rubenstein, the doctor. Remember me? He said, yeah, I remember you, Ian. He said, I was just talking about you the other day to Ralph, another mutual friend. So he came back with me, sat in my kitchen having a smoke. And I realized that a lot of the mediums smoke really heavily. Back door was open. We caught up after 30 years of mutual friends. And I took him back to his, dropped him off in Walthamstow. He said, look, Ian, why don't you sit in my circle? He said, you don't have to be a spiritualist. He said, I don't call myself a spiritualist. I call myself a seeker after truth. And just see what happens. So that's how I ended up, for a laugh, really, sitting in a circle with a bunch of East Enders, really, from London, salt of the earth, mainly working class people, pretty much the people I grew up with. Very different, having a very different experience from what I normally do, working as a doctor with a bunch of doctors. And that's the brief story.
It's fascinating, man. You've had just such an incredible journey just along this path of walking between two worlds, and this is something I do want to get into. I'm gonna wind back some things that I've been thinking about and noting here as you've been talking about it. So we'll do them in reverse order from most recent to. So something that's interesting about what you guys are talking about UK doctors seeking other forms of practice. And over here in the States, man, doctors make quite a bit of money. Now, you come out of medical school with about $300,000 in debt, and that's a whole separate challenge that we work with over here institutionally. But they don't leave their medical practice making however much they make a year to go into mediumship or spirituality, no matter how advantageous that feels for them. The money is generally, of course, we're generalizing. But over in the UK, it may be possible, just something that you've been talking about, just about the medical industry over there and how you've got a fixed salary, really no additional things or no riches, to be made over there because of the way it's set up. And it seems like then UK doctors, in this example, seem to be called more to do something additional to their medical practice, if not leave it altogether to go do something else. Now, do you think that that's a calling, or do you think that it's because they have the opportunity to perhaps financially gain for it doing something?
Well, it's a generational thing. My generation, I'm a baby boomer, and I went to university I came from a working class family. I had a full grant. Education was free. I had a grant to sustain me at university. My generation, with flower power, hippy dippy, money was nothing. It was dirty. And my generation of doctors in the UK, it didn't come into it. Money didn't come into it. You work for the NHS. You work for the good of the patient. It was very much a calling, actually. Yeah. What's happened now is now my son's a doctor. He's in his 30s. That generation, a lot of them had the same problems. They've been burdened with debt. They've come out with, they have student loans. They got a lot of debt. They become more money orientated.
Yeah.
I've never been particularly money orientated. I mean, you do. I mean, I'm not. It pays well, but it's not the sort of super salaries you hear in the United States. No way. It just doesn't work like that because it's a nationalized industry, basically.
Right.
It's a government service. Now, you can have a private practice. I mean, there is I had my private hypnosis practice, which I never made any money from because I used to give the money to my practice because I was a new junior partner and everything I earned was for the good of practice. But if you're a specialist, say a cardiologist, you would have your NHS practice and then on the side you can earn quite a lot of money. So, but not as a primary care physician. I mean, there's nothing in it. I mean, basically it's a free service. I mean, you can't compete against free service and that's not what you go in for.
Yeah.
So the ethos is different, but the ethos of my generation is very different. So because the pressures are different.
This is a good point. The generation versus, I mean, even like you said, what your son's experiencing now. And, it's interesting because there aren't a lot of doctors here, even if they have power, again, we're generalizing, that leave their practice to come, in their minds, take a step down or a pay cut if they are money motivated. There are some doctors who get discredited and disbarred for doing things that are way more acceptable where you're located. Because if somebody tried to hypnotize somebody in a medical office, they'd lose their license. It's not a recognized science. It's pseudoscience. And this is something I do want to touch on with you because I'm very interested in it. So let me ask you about Felicity's face real quick before we move on to the next one. So did she shift into a completely different person, or was there a second face overlaid on hers?
That's a really good question, Brandon. I don't know, because imagine you're looking at someone, all of a sudden there's somebody else there, and it only lasts a few seconds. The interesting thing is, so Keith Hudson loves old books. He's mad about books. He's got this largest collection of old spiritualist books going way back to Victorian days. And of course, I got really into that. I started reading a lot of them. He gave me a lot of books to read. And one thing I realized was that the old spiritualists talk about the ectoplasmic buildup.
Yes.
So they saw a lot of this physical stuff, which we don't see so much now. But they would say that the ectoplasm will build up from the ground upwards, and the face would solidify from the top, the figure, and then the lower bit would take time to solidify. Now, that was being mentioned in a couple of books I read. I remember thinking, well, that chimed with what I saw, because the upper part of the face looked normal. The lower part was distorted.
Yeah.
So whatever was happening, it didn't have a chance to form. But I didn't see any mist forming. It was instantaneous.
You're right. This is what's interesting about it.
Yeah.
And then also...
Yeah, I've sat in transfiguration services and seen mediums say, and they say, oh, look a bit Chinese, or there's a bit of a Native American there, and I've never been convinced. But this was in your face. This was like this absolutely Nordic, blue-eyed, looked straight into you. There was no doubt about it. I mean, having seen that once, I mean, if the CIA said, Ian, we're going to wipe your mind of all your experiences, all your weird stuff, what's the one you want to remember? That's the one I remember, because it is the most stunning. I haven't ever had. It's most stunning because my sister witnessed it as well.
Right. No, it was corroborated.
So it's corroborated. We both saw the same thing.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting because it then lends to the idea of, okay, well, did she just do that or did the spirit guide just change into that form so you could see it? Was it accidental? Was it something energetic?
Okay.
Like a response to the way you felt, right?
I think. Well, I mean, have you ever heard? You've heard of the Enfield poltergeist case,
yes,
haven't you?
Yes.
So, once it started getting known that I was a doctor in Enfield, and my practice covers that area it happened in. So word got around the medical field that I was interested in this stuff. And one of the doctors who's friendly with my wife, she worked with him. He looked after one of the guys who researched the Enfield poltergeist case in the 70s, a guy called Maurice Gross. And he said, why don't you come round and I'll play you all the tapes and tell you what I saw at the Enfield poltergeist case, as you're interested in this. I spent some time with him. And when I told him what happened with his face, he said to me, I think, and I didn't tell him I was training as a medium. He said, Ian, I think you and your sister are undeveloped mediums. And he thought that the energy was coming from me and from my sister, and actually was a physical manifestation. It was probably her spirit guide, he thought, but it was using our energy to manifest. But I've never done anything like that before, and I don't know. But that was his theory.
And this is one of the most interesting things about your story. It seems like a lot of people who can do things like this that aren't, it's not considered necessarily extra. It's just normal to them, like super normal or supernatural. They consider it natural. It's not a big deal. But what's interesting about your story in particular is how other people around that are tapped into this field have been telling you that you're tapped into this field, and it took other people telling you for you to realize it yourself. It wasn't the entities speaking to you as well. You and I have some similar things in common in this. Number one, we're both drop dead good looking. The other thing is that we've both had very similar experiences at similar times. I run into this a lot. I speak to a lot of mediums and people who are not connected at all who tell me, hey, your spirit guide's here and wants me to tell you X. And I don't experience that way. I'm also not a medium, and nobody's ever said you're basically just like a medium that doesn't know it yet. That's not the point. The point is other people have to tell me things that they can see that I can't, but that benefit me whenever it's uttered. So it's either a placebo effect, and maybe that's the way they operate, just in subtlety, which is acceptable. Another thing that was interesting is your 2001 family break. I went through the same thing in 2001. We were different ages, but a couple years apart. But I went through the exact same thing, man. So another thing that you'd mentioned that was fascinating to me is ghost doctors that then talk to you, but encourage you to do more holistic or Eastern medicines rather than physical treatments that they themselves
I haven't had that. Well, I mean, I haven't heard them speak to me.
Okay.
Maybe they've been encouraging me. I don't know. I haven't had that experience. I have had experience with spirit guides, though. Some really weird stuff.
The thing about the Dr. Ghost thing is fascinating to me simply because of what you'd mentioned about it, about other people being told, hey, maybe try this avenue instead. And it's almost like these doctors who were doctors in their physical life, then move on, then gain a better understanding or a little bit of clarity, and then institute that rather than the stuff that you are taught in medical school or anybody's taught in medical school. This is what's so interesting about you in particular, is that you walk between worlds. And I'm curious to know how you adapt between both practices, because they seem to be at odds with each other. But have you found a way to marry them together?
Yeah, I think well, it's difficult. First of all, you've got to understand is that I haven't given up my medical practice.
Right.
I would never charge for mediumship or anything like that, and I wouldn't do it. I mean, I like being a doctor. I mean, I've got to think about retiring. I mean, I've reduced my hours, but I'm actually still doing 7 days a week. That's another question. I won't burden you with that. The big problem, of course, was being struck off. I mean, all of a sudden, you imagine you're working in a busy practice doing serious stuff, where you can get sued if you get it wrong. And then one of the partners starts claiming that he's speaking to dead people. I mean, this is bonkers. Thank God I had really understanding partners who are very, who the culture of my practice is, it's encouraging. If this is interest, if it's helping you, if it's helping people, then go with it.
But see, this type of idea doesn't happen over here. This is why doctors have to keep quiet about it or they get disbarred. Now, this is another interesting thing about you in particular, not necessarily everyone's experience or environment over there in your field. You in particular, with your with the principal back then who was into psychology and was fine with you doing hypnosis as a child, you got it's almost like this luck, that you've got around you constantly because you're encouraged to do this. It's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know anything, but my working hypothesis is that our lives have a pattern.
Yeah.
For instance, how I ended up going to Nottingham Medical School. I can tell you the story with that one. I was going to go to different medical school. I'd applied for 2 different medical schools, and one of them wasn't Nottingham. And then I bumped into an old friend from school, and he just one day I'd been transferred. I used to work at the public library system, and I worked at a regular library. And for one day, I'd been transferred to another library when I was choosing the universities I wanted to apply for. And I bumped into this old friend who was 6 years older than me. He'd been a prefect at school when I was 11, and I respected him. And he asked me what I was doing. I said I was applying for medical school. And he said, have you looked at Nottingham? I said, yeah, but I didn't fancy it. He said, oh, no, you should look again. And he gave me a lift home. And as I got out of the car, I remember him leaning across the passenger seat to me saying, Ian, make sure you look at Nottingham. It's going to be a good medical school. And I did, and I changed my mind. And I ended up going there, ended up meeting my wife. So that was in 1973 when I went to medical school. And I hadn't seen this guy since then. And then one day I'm in the local library in the late 1990s with my wife and 2 little boys in tow. And I realized that there was a guy there who looked like this guy whose name was Leland Lewington, the person who told me to go to medical school. And he had a younger wife and 2 little boys in tow, a bit like me. And I nudged my wife and said, I think that's Leland Lewington. She said, who's he? I said, he's the guy who told me to go to Nottingham. And that's how we met. So it's thanks to him that we're here and our boys are here. So I'm going to go and thank him. So I went up to him and said, are you Lyndon Lewington? He looked a bit blank and took a step backwards. And he said, yes. And I said, he used to twist my ear and call me idiot child, by the way. I said, you used to twist my ear at school and call me idiot child. You told me to go to Nottingham. I went to Nottingham and I met my wife as well. Here's my children. And now I'm a doctor locally. Thank you very much. And he went white and said, oh my God, he said, I remember that. He said, after I told you to go to medical school, I decided I ought to do a medical degree as well. I'm now a specialist cardiologist at Hammersmith Hospital. And this is my wife, who happened to be a nurse who works at the same health visitor, the same health practice that my wife, who's also a doctor, worked at. And here are my two little boys. At which point, the librarian who was listening to us said, "Can you two be quiet? I've never heard such a funny story in all my life." So there's this weird coincidence. And there's another part to this, which I will tell you now, because whilst I'm on the roll with library. So this guy, Lyndon, so when I was at school, how I got friendly with Lyndon was because my school was very rough and we used to get beaten up in the playground. So the one way getting out of the schoolyard fights was to sort of work in the library, stacking books, and I could do my homework. And Lyndon also did that. So that's where we got friendly, and that's where he used to twist my ear and call me idiot child. So that was the library. So I then met him in a library. He then told me to go to medical school in the library, because I then worked at the library with a Saturday job when I was 18. And then we met in a library. And now I'm training as a medium, okay? And I've met my spirit guides. I've fast forwarded a lot. You haven't heard a lot, sorry. But so in spiritualism, so I had this meditation experience, and I was sitting under a bench looking at this, and this guy appeared to me. He said, "I'm your spirit guide. I'm Nestor." So Nestor claimed in my head, this is a conversation in my head, that he was a Nestorian monk. He was the abbot of a Nestorian monastery, and that I actually in a previous life had been, he called me little brother. I was the administrator of the monastery. And I'd been as a fussy little monk who liked everything to be prim and proper. And he explained to me that that's why I like office equipment. That's why I like computers. That was a hangover from that life. Because believe me, I mean, all my life I've been fascinated by office equipment catalogs. I'd get them and look through them, like staple machines. When I was a kid, I actually had a whole office. I had headed notepaper, everything. I just made it up. I still love that sort of thing. Who else looks at office equipment catalogs, and enjoys it? So he said, that's where you get it from. He said, in fact, that's why you chose to be reborn into this century. Which I thought was a really crap reason for being reborn.
I'm just here for the office supplies, guys.
I'm just here for the office automation. I mean, it's bonkers, isn't it? But maybe he's right. Anyway, so I'm having this internal conversation, and it's driving me nuts, because up to this point, I've been giving fairly simple messages within the group of people I was trained with, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But the idea of interacting with internal voices, that's a bit schizophrenic. And here I'm a doctor. I've got to get a handle on this. Is this stuff real? How can it be real? So I'm in a library choosing some books. I also want to buy a pair of sunglasses. So I've got these load of books in my hand, and suddenly I sense my guide. It could be me, I'm not sure, saying, "Ian, you're late for your meeting. This is a Saturday morning. I'm not working." So I'm having this little conversation in my head. Who are you? I'm Nestor, your guide. No, you're not. You're me. No, I'm Nestor. I want to prove it to you. Ian, put the books down, go into the shop to get your sunglasses, and then go into the drugstore. Drugstore's called Boots. It's a drugstore. So I thought, or you'll be late for your meeting. And I'm thinking, I'll go along with this. This is crazy stuff. So I literally put the books down, walked out of the library, went into the shop called Millet's, got my sunglasses, and then I walked. Just across from there is Boots drugstore. So I go into Boots drugstore. As I go in through the door, I thought, now what? And as I walk in through the door, there is Lyndon Lewington.
No way.
With his wife, Kay. Absolutely. And I look at him and he looks at me. I said, "Lyndon." And he says, "Ian." I said, "Lyndon, what are you doing here?" He said, "Just filled out a prescription. What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I came here because my spirit guide told me I was going to meet you there." Well, not you, but actually I was going to have a meeting. And it turned out to be you. And his wife, Kay, looked at Lyndon and said, "Lyndon," as if it was this guy. I realized I was looking like a complete stupid idiot. So I said, "Nice to meet you, Lyndon. Nice to meet you, Kay." Span around on my heel and went out.
And
so, I mean, how the hell does that work? library, the same guy. I mean, I just don't follow it. I mean,
you mentioned the word coincidence, and I would.
It's not coincidence.
Well, this is the thing, right? I think
put up job, isn't it?
Right, and this is it, right? It's not. It's synchronicities. Now, something that you're saying about spirit guides, I've got a lot to say on that. But I am fascinated by the level of synchronicities that your life has embodied. Now, if you look back at it, everything having to do with the library, well, that's where knowledge is found. I mean, that's you're in a sense, and what's interesting too is all of your correlations to higher consciousness or high strangeness have occurred in a place with books, with knowledge, where you're supposed to get this Western style, knowledge from, not this Eastern hippy dippy stuff.
I've never noticed that. It's a very good point, Brandon.
It's interwoven, which is very interesting. And what, again, you have this life of, if anybody doesn't believe in soul contracts, just have a conversation with you, because you have the most laid out, synchronistic. But again, and you're only about a year and a half older than me, but you've had a good amount of time to pay attention to these types of synchronicities, and you've got the eyes to see when something's significant in that way and not simply accidental or coincidental, which is what I find interesting and fascinating. So I have way too much stuff to talk to you about on this episode. I think that I am definitely going to have you back, because we have some deep dives that you and I need to go into. But just due to timing, there is one more thing that I want to talk about before we wrap it up. And then you and I are going to schedule another one of these, because you are fascinating, man. So what do you think is the idea between the marrying of the science and the philosophies? Because you have been given a very left brain education, but you've always tended towards the mysterious, rather than you are extremely dialed into it or not. It just seemed pretty ancillary to you. So again, it speaks back to the fact that it's not supernatural, it's just pretty natural. It's just something that happens, and that you're pretty dialed into it. So what do you think that is? Do you think that that's the next step for medicine, like actual medicine is where we start getting a little bit more holistic?
Well, this is where it gets a bit sad for me. I mean, when I trained in general practice, the field was dominated by, in the UK, a guy called Michael Ballant, who was a Hungarian psychotherapist who took a holistic view, and he looked at the psychological aspects of family practice. Really important. So the way I say it is, when you're a medical student, you get to learn how to make a physical diagnosis. When you qualify as a doctor, you begin to realize it's not just physical, there's the psychology, and that's very important.
Very important.
When you go into family practice or general practice or whatever you call it, primary care, you're dealing with family, you realize that you make a social diagnosis. Yeah? You've got to see the patient in context. You've got to see their illness in the context of their society, and what it means to them, how they got it, food they ate, all that sort of stuff. And then I began to get into what I would now call a spiritual diagnosis. Now, that's not, by that I don't mean I'm using pendulums to diagnose, and there's an energy thing. I'm not. By that I mean I search for meaning.
Yeah.
So the next phase is, what does this mean to the person? So I spent a lot of time, even before I got into this, I was always asking my patients, what's the pattern of your life? What does this mean to you? How does this illness fit into your life? What have you learned from it? But that's what I call a spiritual diagnosis. But of course, there's all the other stuff, the energy side stuff may or may not be real. Acupuncture works. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
A lot of it doesn't fit in with Western style stuff. But maybe there is an energy, a subtle energy, or maybe what we call energy is actually information. I think physicists get very upset when you talk about energy, but I tend to think that we live in an infoverse.
Nice.
It's about information. And we could talk about that. I mean, we had a brief discussion when we first met about the idea of your user interface into reality.
Yes.
So, I don't think we've got the context. Personally, I did hope that when I ended up speaking to dead people, because I do get messages, we haven't talked about that, but eventually I ended up putting in messages from seemingly deceased people, and using it as bereavement counseling, and it's very, very powerful. I did hope that that's something I could introduce more widely into medicine, but I'm afraid certainly the way medicine's going is going very, very scientific and technical. I love science and tech. Don't get me wrong. I love science. I like the technical sides of it, but eventually that will be done by a robot or an AI.
And this is the point, right? Is because it does seem to be more automated and more technologically centric. So they're doing this for a number of reasons. Maybe it is to not truly diagnose. I mean, and like I said, you and I have a long conversation to have about medical industry. I think that this episode is wonderful because it's set up your backstory and it's set up where you are. And I am really looking forward to diving into these deep concepts with you the next time that we speak, because now we've laid that foundation.
Yeah.
So Like I said, I have a ton of things that I want to talk to you about because it's rolling around in my mind, your leaps of faith. I mean, everything about how this is all connected. So let's do this. I'm going to leave everybody on a teaser, and then you and I are going to schedule another one very soon. Like, let's get this in pretty quick while this is fresh. As far as time goes, though, let's wrap this one up for today. So if you don't mind, tell my audience where they can find you. We're going to leave them on a big cliffhanger, but the next episode we have, we're going to go balls deep on it.
Okay, well, if you just Google my name, you'll find it. I've got a website. It's not the best of websites. I don't really maintain it very well, but this is my book.
I think it's quaint. It's perfect. You've got the videos from your spiritualist church, and it's brilliant.
Oh, well, if you just type in Ian Rubenstein or Dr. Ian Rubenstein, you'll find it's www.drianrubenstein.com. But there's my book, Consulting Spirit, which outlines my journey. I will now turn that off. What can I say? It's my journey.
I'll link to your website for sure, so that everybody can find you there. But guys, stay tuned because him and I are really going to go into it next time, man. Ian, I can't thank you enough, man. This has been wonderful. Your story is fascinating, and we are just getting the tip of the iceberg here. Really looking forward to the next one.
Okay, nice to see. We'll get together again soon, Brandon. Thank you for your time.
Definitely. Thank you, sir.
Okay, cheers.
Absolutely fascinating guy, absolutely fascinating story. So stay tuned for part 2, guys. It will be released pretty soon here, but go show Dr. Ian Rubenstein some love. He does some incredible work. He is, if nothing else, he's got a wonderful heart, and he's got an incredible story. So go down in the show notes for all of the ways to find him, and that's how you can do it. So as far as this show goes, guys, you can find us at expandingrealitypodcast.com. That is where the links to all of the socials will be found, as well as the YouTube video of this will be linked directly from there as well. Patreon's over there, and y'all know how that works, so thank you so much for your contributions. You guys go out into your week this week and get out of that left-hand lane. Do something nice for somebody else. Pick up a piece of litter. By nice, I mean just buy somebody a cup of coffee. Hold a door open. It's not hard. We live in a society. Let's enjoy each other out here. If you take nothing else from this show, guys, go out into your world this week and every week, and y'all just be good to one another. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.